is a little bit like the fellow that was going to the races. And for 3 nights, he dreamed of the number 5. So when he got to the track, he opened a program to the 5th race, and he looked down to the number 5 horse. And the horse's name was 5 by 5. Well, that did it. He bet the whole bundle on that horse, number 5 in the 5th race. And the horse came in 5th.
Good morning. It is Monday, January the 23rd, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the daily declaration for spiritual warfare, the Pledge of Allegiance, and the Star-Spangled Banner, we will have Bill Maher, Monterey Park, Alex-Epstein, No Free Lunch, and the Rape of the Mind, Pavlov's Dog. All that and more when I get back. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen.
Your heart, face your parents, ready, begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Mercy, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleam? Whose stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight, all the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets was rusting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does the star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the
Thank you. And now there's No Free Lunch, 250 Economic Truths by David-Bahnsen.
We have come to love income tax laws so much that we have chosen to have a lot of them. The resulting loss of efficiency in our economy and cost of private sector compliance are staggering. Gordon D. Henderson. We couldn't leave it alone with high taxes. We had to create high complexity and high burdens to go along with the high costs. So it always is. Any diminishment of freedom results in multiple ways to lose. The greed and recklessness and power aspiration of government is evidenced in the tax code, yet all at once, so is the inefficiency, bureaucracy, and general incompetence. A truly losing combination of circumstances.
And that was There's No Free Lunch by David-Bahnsen. Back in a minute. Thank you. And about the shooting yesterday, the crime that was committed yesterday, in Monterey Park in which 10 people were murdered. 10 others were, the assailant attempted to murder them but failed. They were injured. Actually, there's 11 people, total 11 people. I got the latest update now is that 11 people were murdered and 9 were assaulted or shot. So I grieve for the loss of life, for the loss of these folks, but I also know what's coming. So does everyone else. We know that immediately the left, the governor's already started with turning this into a political opportunity. It's bloodthirsty and it's despicable, but he's turning this into a political opportunity. And shame on him for doing that. He's wrong to do so. This was a crime, not a political act. I'm sure he'd love to turn every act in this country and probably in the state into political acts, but they're not. This was a criminal act, and this demonstrates Newsom's weakness when it comes to law enforcement. It is Newsom that is out saying, defund the police. And this is the result. So remember, folks, if you're confronted or talking to somebody, whoever it happens to be, your mailman or a relative, friend, whatever, neighbor, and they're talking about gun violence, you must reframe the discussion. It is a crime. It is a criminal activity. That's what it is. It was murder, and murder is a crime. It's not a political opinion. Murder is a crime. So you reframe the discussion as one about crime and law enforcement, because that's what it's really all about. But the left, Gavin Newsom and company, they want to frame the debate as gun violence. You notice they always say that, gun violence, gun violence. And they're full of hot air, and we know that because when somebody gets stabbed, you don't hear Gavin Newsom decrying knife violence. Somebody gets beaten up, he never decries fist violence. Okay, so it's all about undermining the Second Amendment, and we're not going to let him get away with that. The proper frame for this discussion is law enforcement and crime. This was a crime. And that's the way you have to handle it. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now a little bit of Bill Maher.
The Biden infrastructure bill has a provision that requires all new cars to install an alert system that goes off when you leave a baby in the back seat, which is something done only by crackheads and people who sadly, yes, do it on purpose. And after every one of us winds up bearing the cost for cars to install this alarm, you know who's going to ignore it? Crackheads and people who do it on purpose. Democrats no longer possess the common sense to understand that not every problem in the world can be fixed with a regulation. But don't tell that to the advocacy groups who also want every future car in America to only start when the driver blows into a breathalyzer. Oh, great, my other car is a Karen. You know, it's also not safe to drive when you're crying. Should we make a car that follows your texts and stops the engine when you're dumped? Racism is bad. How about a car that won't start unless you play a message about tolerance from George Takei?
Thank you. Now, 2 minutes of Alex Epstein.
You know, one of the things that strikes me as so utterly absurd, it's partly why I found your book so interesting, is that somehow the people who are making such arguments have gained the moral upper hand.
Yeah, there's a lot of really interesting stuff going on. I mean, I think one thing why do they have the moral high ground? And this is something is really a core mission of mine to correct, is that, as I mentioned before, they really owned the issue of a good environment starting in the 60s, including loving nature, including caring about clean air and clean water, and more recently, caring about safety from climate. And that the pro-capitalism side really didn't concern themselves too much with this, rhetorically at least. And so the anti-capitalist side was able to own this issue. And when you own something as important as our environment and our planet, you do get the moral high ground. And then they supplemented this with this false alternative of you are either a climate change believer who hates fossil fuels, or you are a climate change denier who thinks fossil fuels are okay. So they created this total false alternative, which made no sense, because what makes sense with climate impact is to weigh it along with the benefits of fossil fuels. You cannot judge a prescription drug by only looking at negative side effects, and you can't judge fossil fuels by only looking at negative side effects or exaggerating negative side effects. You have to look carefully at our climate impacts, negative and positive, and then weigh them against the benefits that come with fossil fuels, including all the benefits that protect us from climate. So there's this false alternative. So what they did is they owned the morality of caring about our environment, and they owned the claim to science, because the climate change denial thing, so-called, didn't make much sense, because it's pretty obvious we impact climate at least some. But so doing those two things, they owned this issue. So people think, well, if I want to be a good person, if I want a good planet, and I want to be pro-science, then I have to hate fossil fuels. And a lot of what I've tried to do, and I think Michael Schellenberger and Bjorn Lomborg and Steve Koonin, I think what we've tried to do is look at climate in a humanistic, full context way. And we're breaking this false alternative, which is a lot of the reason we get a lot of hostility.
So that was Alex Epstein, 2 minutes of Alex Epstein, and a couple of things. First of all, he's talking about making the moral case, and the reason that the left wins is because they have succeeded in getting the moral high ground. No, they've succeeded in getting the rhetorical and psychological high ground. So, for instance, they're the ones, what they do is they put you in a position, if you're a supporter of fossil fuels or just a supporter of the status quo, then they demand that you explain and justify the status quo, which is very, very difficult to do. And it's also unnecessary. The presumption is always made for the status quo. That's what we do. And so that means that I don't have to justify anything. If the left doesn't like fossil fuels, the burden of proof is on them. They have to prove, and then we could say that the standard can be, beyond a reasonable doubt, or at least by preponderance of the evidence, that something else is better than fossil fuels. And they have failed to do that. So remember that. They're always going to try and put you on the spot. They always do that, and they do it rhetorically by making an arbitrary claim and asking you to take their word for it. So they'll say, quote a statistic. Well, their statistics show this. Science shows that. Well, where's your proof? They don't even bother. They demand that you take their word for it, that there is such science, or that there is such a statistic. You don't have to. I've told you before. You don't have to take people's word for it. You don't have to take my word for it. You don't have to take the socialist word for it either. And the way you would deal with that is simply by coming out, and one of the best ways is simple contradiction. Oh, well, there's a study that says blah, blah, blah. No, there isn't. Oh, but there's a survey that says, no, there isn't. And now they're jammed up. They have to put up or shut up. And it's their responsibility. Now, what they'll do, of course, in response is not give you any details about their evidence. What they will do is they will try to turn the argument and turn it back on you, getting you to prove a negative. And very often the way they do that is by making an accusation at this point. So if they say, well, there's a study that says such and such, you say, no, there isn't. Then they'll say, oh, well, you must be a climate denier. Now, what are they doing there? They're making another arbitrary claim. Okay? And again, I don't have to accept that. And you just say, no, I'm not. And again, the burden of proof is on them. It's up to them to prove that I'm a climate denier at this particular point. But that's the kind of things that they do. And so you're going to end up, you have to be sharp about this, and you have to listen carefully and ask yourself, what are they doing? Not concentrating so much on what they're saying, but on what they're doing. And then you will succeed in being able to, once you see what they're doing, figuring out the appropriate response. So again, I like the fact that Alex Epstein is defending fossil fuels, and he's the only one that's doing that, but defense is not necessary. It's not our job to defend anything. What we should be doing is simply demanding evidence and asking questions. Okay? Also, he's missing the real point of the whole climate debate, and that is CO2. If the left can convince everybody that CO2 must be regulated, they run the world. Because we breathe CO2, animals breathe CO2, there's a CO2 emissions in almost anything and everything that goes on. Making cement supposedly produces CO2. CO2 is a byproduct. So if they can convince everybody that CO2 is the ultimate culprit here, then they can run the world. They will sit back and have some kind of a regulatory, maybe the EPA, maybe there'll be a special separate regulatory body to regulate CO2, in which case then they get to tell you how many children you can have, again, for the greater good, all for the greater good, but it's CO2. So when somebody says to you, the climate, look at this, all this river of rain that's coming into California, it's crazy. All you have to do is say, yeah, but not because of the CO2. Not because of carbon dioxide. I do it all the time, and every time I do it, they shut up and just stare at me. And that's when I say, have a nice day, and walk away. Thank you. And now, the rape of the mind, the salivating dog.
The salivating dog. In the latter part of the 19th century, the Russian Nobel Prize winner Ivan Petrovich Pavlov conducted his famous experiments with a bell and a dog. He knew that salivation is associated with eating, and that if a dog was hungry, its mouth would water each time it saw food. Pavlov took advantage of this useful inborn reflex, which serves the digestive process, to develop in his experimental animal the salivating response in answer to a stimulus which would not ordinarily create it. Each time Pavlov fed the dog, he rang a bell, and at each feeding the dog's mouth watered. Then, after many repetitions of the combined food bell stimulus, Pavlov rang the bell but did not feed the dog. The animal reacted to the bell alone, just as it had previously reacted to the sight of food. Its mouth watered. Thus, the scientist had found out that the dog could be induced to salivate involuntarily in response to an arbitrary signal. It had been conditioned to respond to the ringing of the bell as if that sound were the smell and taste of food. From this and other experiments, Pavlov developed his theory of the conditioned reflex, which explains learning and training as the building up of a mosaic of conditioned reflexes, each one based on the establishment of an association between different stimuli. The greater the number of learned complex responses, also called patterns, the greater number of conditioned reflexes developed. Because man, of all animals, has the greatest capacity for learning, he is the animal with the greatest capacity for such complicated conditioning. Pavlov's experiments were of great value in the study of animal and human behavior, and in the study of the development of neurotic symptoms. However, this knowledge of some of the mechanisms of the human mind can be used, as we have seen already, like any other knowledge, either for good or for evil. And unfortunately, the totalitarians have used their knowledge of how the mind works for their own purposes. They have applied some of the Pavlovian findings in a subtle and complicated way, and sometimes in a grotesque way, to try and produce the reflex of mental and political conditioning and of submission in the human guinea pigs under their control. Even though the Nazis employed these methods before the Second World War, they can be said to have reached their full flower in Soviet Russia. Through a conditioned repetition of indoctrination, bell ringing, and feeding, the Soviet man is expected to become a conditioned reflex machine, reacting according to a prearranged pattern, as did laboratory dogs. At least, such a simplified concept is roaming around in the minds of some of the Soviet leaders and scientists. Dobrogev. In accordance with one of Stalin's directives, Moscow maintains a special Pavlovian front, Dobrogev, and a scientific council on the problems of physiological theory of the academician I.P. Pavlov, London. These institutions, part of the Academy of Science, are dedicated to the political application of the Pavlovian theory. They are under orders to emphasize the purely mechanical aspects of Pavlov's findings. Such a theoretical view can reduce all human emotions to a simple, mechanistic system of conditioned reflexes. Both organizations are control agencies dealing in research problems, and scientists who work on them explore the ways in which man can theoretically be conditioned and trained as animals are. Since Pavlovian theory is proclaimed by the obdurate totalitarian theoreticians as the gospel of animal and human behavior, we have to grapple with the facts they adduce to prove their point, and with their methods and theoretical explanations. What the Pavlovian Council tries to achieve is the result of an oversimplification of psychology. Their political task is to condition and mold man's mind so that its comprehension is confined to a narrow totalitarian concept of the world. It is the idea that such a limitation of thinking to Lenin Marxist theoretical thinking must be possible for two reasons. First, if one repeats often enough its simplification, and second, if one withholds any other form of interpretation of reality. This concept is based on the naive belief that one can permanently suppress any critical function and verification in human thinking. Yet, through taming and conditioning of people, during which period errors and deviations must continually be corrected, unwittingly a critical sense is built up. True, at the same time, the danger of using this critical sense is brought home to the students. They know the dangers of any dissent, but even this promotes the development of a secondary and more refined critical sense. In the end, human rebellion and dissent cannot be suppressed. They await only one breath of freedom in order to awake once more. The idea that there exists other ways to truth than those he sees close at hand lives somewhere in everybody. One can narrow his pathway of research and expression, but man's belief in adventurous new roads elsewhere is ever present in the back of his mind. The inquisitive human mind is never satisfied with a simple recital of facts. As soon as it observes a set of data, it jumps into the area of theory and offers explanations. But the way a man sees a set of facts, and the way he juggles them to build them into a theory, is largely determined by his own biases and prejudices. Let me be the first to confess that I am affected by my own subjectivities. Even the words we use are loaded with implications and suggestions. The word reflex, for example, so important in Pavlovian theory, is a perfect instance of this. It was first used by the 17th century philosopher Descartes, in whose philosophical system a parallel was made between the actions of the human body and those of a machine. For example, in the Cartesian view, the automatic reaction of the body to certain painful stimuli, e.g., withdrawing the hand after it has come into contact with fire, is compared with the automatic physical reflection of light from a mirror. The nervous system, according to Descartes, reflects its response just as the mirror does. Such a simple explanation of behavior, and the very words used to describe it, immediately denies the whole organism taking part in that response. Yet man is not only a mirror, but a thinking mirror. According to an old mechanical view, actions are associated only with the part of the body which performs them, and they have no relationship whatsoever to the purposeful behavior of the organism as a whole. But man is not a machine composed of independently functioning parts. He is a whole. His mind and body interact. He acts on the outside world, and the outside world acts on him. The innate reflexes, of which this hand withdrawal is one example, are part of a whole system of adaptive responses which serve to help the individual as an entity to adjust to changed circumstances. They can be described as the result of an inborn adaptation tendency. The only real difference between the innate reflexes and the conditioned reflexes is that the former supposedly have developed in the entire race over millions of years of the evolutionary process, while the latter are developed during the lifespan of the individual as a result of the gradual automation of acquired responses. If you analyze any one of the complicated actions you may perform during the course of a single day, driving an automobile, for example, you will see that it occurs outside your conscious management. And yet, before the process could be automatized, the actions purposefully directed toward the satisfaction of some goal had to be consciously learned and managed. You were not born with the innate reflex of jamming on the brake to stop a car quickly in an emergency. You had to learn to do it, and in the process of learning and driving, this response became automatic. If, after you have learned to drive, you see a child running across the path of your car, you put the brake on immediately by reflex without thinking.
And that was The Salivating Dog by from The Rape of the Mind by Joost-meerlo. Back in a minute. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. Until next time, remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.